discussion of blind bombing.
Oh, sure.
I'm Dr. Sheldon Goldberg, docent and historian at the museum, and a former Air Force Navigator bombardier, which makes me really interested in this presentation. Just 6 days ago, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, and what you are about to hear will be a story of an invention that was not mentioned in 12 O'Clock High, but helped bring that war to an end. Norman Fine, the author of Blind Bombing, whose book was just awarded the Independent Publishers Association's Silver Medallion, is an electrical engineer who formed a company with a colleague that designed and manufactured state-of-the-art high-resolution radar and infrared displays for aerial reconnaissance used by the Navy and Air Force during the Cold War. He has also been an editor, author, publisher, and an avid horseman. You will also hear from Mr. George Jacobs, a former B-17 Navigator and G-system operator, who will discuss his role and interface with the H-2X or Mickey radar navigator during missions over Germany during World War II. Following the talks, information on how to purchase blind bombing will be provided, and there will be a question and answer period. You can also write your questions on the Zoom chat function, which you should find at the bottom of your screen. This program will also be on YouTube. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Norman Fine, author of Blind Bombing.
Thank you all. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. Let me begin by telling you why I wrote Blind Bombing. I had learned the bones of the story many years ago and realized it was clearly a vitally important story to the outcome of the war, yet it had been pretty much ignored by popular historians writing for a general audience. It's a story about a new top secret invention made on the very eve of the war by two British physicists that turned out to be the most influential gadget in the winning of the war. Yes, the atomic bomb was an earth-shaking invention, literally, but it didn't win the war. The war was already won. The bombs dropped on those two cities, Nagasaki, Hiroshima, ended the war abruptly, and in so doing saved thousands of Allied lives from having to invade the Japanese mainland. The invention was a small gadget, small enough to be held in the palm of a man's hand. It turned out to be the single most important new invention in the winning of the war. Yet scarcely anyone has ever heard of it. According to what most of us know from the history books, the Allied strategy for getting to D-Day was to strategically bomb Germany, destroy their war-making infrastructure, production plants, railroad hubs, energy sources, and then land troops and supplies on the Normandy coast, secure the beachhead, and fight their way toward Berlin and victory. This overarching account, however, really ignores the fact that without this new invention, the Allies would not have gotten to D-Day, June 6, 1944, D-Day as we know it.
Yes, please come here.
Without this new invention. It was called a resonant cavity magnetron. I know that's a mouthful. It was unknown to the rest of the world, and it improved the performance of radar as it was then known by thousands fold. It enabled radar to operate at much higher frequencies, and that was the key to unlocking the promise of radar. Completely unknown to the enemy, microwave radar. Mike, could we have that first slide, resonant cavity magnetron? Okay, right. Yeah, the first slide. That's it, yeah. That's the cavity magnetron. It's It's actually the very first, it's in a museum in Canada right now, Winnipeg. It's the very first cavity magnetron that US radar scientists ever saw. It was shown to them, it was brought here by a mission, a technical mission from Britain. And everyone that saw it and saw the results were astounded. All the developed nations had radars, I mean, especially the warring nations, Germany, Japan, England, America, but it was primitive because it operated at much lower frequencies. It required huge antennas as big as the side of a barn, cumbersome electronics equipment, large, power hungry, much too big to put in a truck or a plane. And it was useful, of course, and very useful for defensive ground installations, fixed installations, but not mobile offensive warfare. So let's look at January 1, 1944. After 4 years of bombing by the British and nearly 2 years of bombing by the US 8th Air Force from bases in Britain, Germany's war-making infrastructure was still operational and her Air Force was still a potent threat. The Allies were insistent on staging D-Day that summer, but the preconditions had not yet been met. Yet, just 6 months later, on June 6, 1944, the day the Allies put 150,000 men on the Normandy beaches with their equipment, their weapons, their ammunition, there was scarcely a German plane in the sky to oppose them. Of the few German planes that were still airworthy, they had no fuel to run them and no spare parts to repair them, and scarcely very few experienced pilots left to fly them.
The bottom.
Considering the earlier years of bombing by the RAF and the United States Air Force and not getting the job done, how was it finally accomplished in just 6 months? Microwave radar, made possible by the resonant cavity magnetron, was introduced into the 8th Air Force heavy bombing strategy early in 1944, in January 1944, and it solved a huge obstacle to the bombing campaign. Anyone guess what that could be? The weather, the stormy, perpetually overcast European weather, especially during the winter months. During those years of Allied bombing, up to January 1, 1944, especially in the bad weather seasons, late fall, winter, early spring, bomber formations were able only to complete missions like 70 to 80% of the time. That's the statistics. That's like 7 days a month on average, not enough. By late 1943, Air Force leaders knew they had to do something different or they'd be losing their planes to the Pacific Theater. They took a big chance, they listened to the scientists, and they prayed that with the new radar sets installed in a few heavy bombers to lead the formations, they could get into the air nearly every day, despite the weather, finally achieve the prerequisites to D-Day. Yet that plan was fiercely resisted by many Air Force leaders and veteran airmen in Europe. Could we see that Pathfinder plane? Now, the next slide. Yeah. There's a telltale on that plane that shows that it's a Pathfinder, radar equipped. Just see that pod protruding from the belly of the aircraft. What they did was they took out the belly gunner's turret and they replaced it with the rotating antenna, microwave antenna, and that radome. Can we see the next slide, radar scope image? This is the radar called the H2X radar, called a Mickey. That's the Mickey operated station. It was on the starboard side of the plane over the wing. And he didn't need a window. He had all the information he needed right on that scope face and from his maps and charts. So what made microwave radar so superior? The cavity magnetron, as we said, allowed radar to operate at much higher radio frequencies. Smaller, and that means smaller antennas, much smaller, smaller equipment, takes less power, good for aircraft. And the system could detect much smaller objects than the old radar could, like a submarine periscope protruding from the vastness of the ocean. The low frequency radars before microwave would be hard pressed to even see an entire submarine on the surface at any really useful distance if they were looking for it. The ocean is huge. Before the resonant cavity magnetron, the maximum power that could be transmitted at those very high frequencies was terribly low, only 20 watts. There was only one or two gadgets that could really transmit power, pulses, radar pulses, far enough so they could get good reflections and signals back. 20 watts. The resonant cavity magnetron, in the first test ever of the prototype in the laboratory, produced 30,000 watts of power at those frequencies. That's the difference between the light emitted from a 20-watt bulb and the light emitted from 3 carbon arc searchlights. Huge. Magnetron was truly the holy grail that radar developers around the world were seeking, but only the Allies had it. And the enemy was mystified by their losses. First obstacle were the U-boats. Could have realized Britain, an island nation, they required open shipping lanes to survive. They were short of everything necessary for their survival and for war, going to war. Many US statesmen and military leaders were convinced that Britain would fall. Hitler's plan was to invade Britain, England, across the channel from they were massing troops in northern France. US hadn't even entered the war yet. His plan was to invade in September of 1940. Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, believed he could win the war with the U-boat alone. And he well might have done so had Hitler given him the number of U-boats he wanted. And absent microwave radar, which found those U-boats finally. Had the U-boats not been conquered by microwave radar and had Britain fell, from where would the Allies have launched any kind of a huge invasion, a D-Day invasion, a massive invasion? The rest of Europe was either enemy occupied or neutral. So the second obstacle was the weather. And let's go back to January 1, 1944 again. D-Day is just 6 months away. The requisites are still not accomplished because of the weather. US Air Force had this wonderful Norden bomb sight, but if the bombardier couldn't see his target through the overcast, he couldn't drop bombs to any effect. German factories, January 44, were still producing. Luftwaffe still flying in strength. The Allies needed to get into the air every day they could, bomb targets relentlessly, and force the Luftwaffe into the air so they could shoot them down. So at the beginning of January 44, 8th Air Force totally revamped their bombing protocols by putting the radar-equipped plane in front of the formation. On January 1, there were only 10 radar-equipped planes in Europe. The plane would lead the formations, would drop the first bombs and marker flares. All the planes following in its wake would simply toggle their bombs to fall on his flares. Blind bombing. Could we have the next slide, please? This is a shot over no, the one before that. Yeah, that's the one. You see bombers flying over a total overcast. Hamburg is under there with oil refineries. And those black smudges bubbling up through the overcast are burning oil tanks from those refineries. The whole plan was fraught with startup problems, equipment failures at the beginning, unforeseen crew failures, trying to implement this new offensive weapon that had never been used before. In the early days, it was even close to being scrapped altogether. It was fiercely resisted by the veteran crews and by the squadron leaders for a number of reasons. Some were legitimate, some not. First, radar bombing was not as accurate as visual bombing, but by getting into the air and completing so many more missions, they were certainly ahead of the game. Also, there was no prior combat experience. There were no manuals, no procedures. Radar operators were learning by the seat of their pants. The rest of the air crew didn't know the radar navigator's problems or how to work with him. But after a couple of months and high-level meetings between the stakeholders, the problems were getting worked out. So to answer the question, what did the Resonant cavity magnetron accomplish? Well, many things, actually millions of them were manufactured in this country. Many of them were used for directing gun laying systems, automatically following the targets from the ground, airborne targets on naval ships, automatic gun direction. But to me, the microwave radar was most influential in first winning the U-boat war, then overcoming the foul European weather, both critical impediments to D-Day. Okay, one last slide, please. No, the one of the, yeah, that's the one. That's an image of a radar navigator pointing a piece of flak, pretty big piece of flak, to the hole that had burst through right next to his, narrowly missing him and hitting his equipment, giving him some problems to begin with. About 25 years ago, I interviewed two men. One was George Valley, the physicist, who was a project manager for designing and testing the blind bombing radar at MIT, at the radiation lab at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. After the war, among other important technical achievements, he served as chief scientist in the 50s for the United States Air Force, made important contributions to Cold War defense. The other man I was able to interview was the man in the picture. He was the trained Air Force navigator who brought the very first production model of the H-2X, the Mickey, to Britain to begin his combat tour. He was born and raised in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but Cambridge is the only thing these two men had in common. This young fellow was far removed from the high-powered technical achievements going on at MIT. He was a homeboy, probably had never been more than 100 miles from Cambridge in his life when he was caught up in the peacetime draft in 1940 at the age of 21. He was my uncle, and I know some of his daughters and children sons are watching. Stan Fine. And these two men add a really human dimension to my story. As you'll read through their firsthand experiences, they were an integral part of this small band of scientists and warriors, both British and American, who first had to overcome the apathy and the resistance of their own military establishments before they could go on and finally overcome the enemy. So I thank you very much for being here, for listening. I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you might have. But first I want to turn this back to your hosts Mike Rugel, Sheldon Goldberg, and George Jacobs, who was actually there at the time we're talking. Thanks again. Mike,
George, if you're ready to go.
Yeah,
George, you ready?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
We
you.
hear you.
Okay.
Or you can put your question in here.
Any questions first? And then, well,
Yeah.
any questions on Norm's presentation? Then I'll tell you a little bit about my own experiences.
I had just one question, and that is, did the RAF have any of these radar units installed in their aircraft, in their bombers? Anybody hear that?
Yeah, I can take that. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. The RAF, well, it was invented in England. The RAF was ahead of us most of the way. They absolutely had their own system. We worked very closely. The US worked very closely together with them, the technical people and the armed forces and the Air Force people. Yes, they had it too.
Thank you.
But their bombing was so different. Ours was trying to be strategic, specific, hit only military target, only things that helped the war, only things part of the military infrastructure. But their bombing was a little bit different. They went up at night. We bombed during the day. They went up at night and they dropped bombs where they thought targets would be, but it was a wider spread attack.
Yeah, Norm, one question. It's been a while since I read your book, but I seem to remember that the big difference between what the RAF was using and where'd Norm go? And what, oh, there you are. And what they developed at the Rad Lab was that they were using like 10-centimeter radar, is that correct?
Yeah, yeah.
And the 3-centimeter radar is really what gave them the accuracy to be able to penetrate the clouds and see the landscape. Wasn't that a big difference?
Yeah, Mel, you're right in that these airborne radars started out at a 10-centimeter wavelength. That's a pretty short wavelength. Both the U.S. and the U.S., the Brits needed us to produce a lot of the equipment the Brits used, even 10 centimeters, especially in the war, in the Battle of the Atlantic, were 10-centimeter radars, were built by the U.S. and we shipped them there for them. That's one of the things they wanted from us early on. The U.S. started, Rad Lab started developing a 3-centimeter radar, 3 times the frequency. And, but the Brits did too. The Brits had a 10-centimeter airborne, just as we did, but we didn't really find it useful. They weren't that concerned with the accuracy we were looking for. So we developed a 3-centimeter. They didn't want ours because we were bombing from like 30,000 feet and they were bombing from much lower. So the problems were different and they wanted their own. And they built their own 3-centimeter radar as well. Later, you know, about the same time we did, little month after maybe, that it was employed. Does that answer that? No?
Yeah, that does it.
Okay.
Exactly right. There was a difference in bombing techniques and somewhat ego involved. And there were the 2 systems, the British system and the RAF and ours. But I should point out that as a navigator, we had 2 systems available to us, and they worked very much hand in hand. The system that the British started as OBO was developed into what we call GEE. It is actually the predecessor to today's GPS. We didn't have satellites in those days. Today, GPS works from satellites, putting the signals together in a little computer in your car and putting it on a map. We used terrestrial stations, that is, we used 2 radio stations instead of the satellites, and we were able to do the same thing, a little bit more clumsy because part of it had to be done manually. But we were able to, the difference was that the G, which preceded H2X by several years, or in operation at least by 2 years, operated on the VHF band. It's about 100 megahertz. And G was just a receiver. It was not a transceiver like H2X. H2X transmitted its own radio signal and then received the pulse back, and that was very important because with G, we depended on 2 stations on terrestrial ground to provide us the signal. The range of those signals at that frequency range was at 25,000 feet was no more than 300 miles. So that was a navigation system. It was very, very good. Later on, it was improved, used with H2X. But at that time, it was the only navigation system available that could be used outside of actually just visible. And our Air Force, my bomb group, and I went through all of the records to make sure I had the right figures. The history of our bomb group, the history of every record we flew. We flew our first mission using only G and visual, or dead reckoning, looking out the window. I remember that the Navigator set up in the bubble of the nose in front of the pilots, just about even with the wings. And we had complete bubble. We could see in all directions. In fact, for most of us, we've learned a lot about Europe visibly just by sitting up there. But anyway, my group, the 91st Bomb Group, flew its first mission on March 11th of 1942. And I took the records for the first year from March 11, 42 until 12/31/1943. There are 183 alerts. Alerts means this was the message that came from higher up to the bomb group to prepare for a mission. Of those 183 alerts, 98 missions were completed, 54 were canceled. That was a complete, that meant only 54% of the missions alerted actually flew in the first year. That was a year without radar. We did have G, but we didn't have radar. Navigation on the bombing mission after about 300 miles, navigation was strictly old-fashioned visual navigation, looking out the window. I don't have the record of the first mission flown, the first H2X mission flown by the 91st Bomb Group, but it was either very late 1943 or early 1944. Now, I looked at the records for 1944. From the January 1st, 1944 to the 31st of 1944, there were 231 alerts. 231 missions were scheduled. 175 were completed, and that was a percentage of 76%. So with the first year of radar, our rate of completed missions went from 54% to 76%. In the last quarter, the quarter I served in actually, from the 1st of January 1945 to the 4th of February, to June 1945, there were 86 alerts, 67 completed missions for an efficiency of 80%. So to make a very long story on the success of H2X, we see it right here in the figures. It improved the efficiency of our bombing from about half being completed to at least 3/4 being successfully. The two navigation systems, G and H2X, worked together very nicely. It was sort of like hands and gloves. Every PFF bomber. That PFF means it was equipped with both. Flew with 2 navigators. The G navigator was in the nose, and the H2X navigator was in what had been the radio shack in the middle of the airplane. And we worked together very well. Usually the G took the airplane, usually up to what we call the IP, the initial point. The initial point was the distance from, in our case, our airfield called Bassingbourn to just before the target, usually about 20 miles. Then from the IP to the target, before we had the H2X was in the hands of the bombardier. He controlled the plane actually with the Northern Barb sight. So the G navigator would bring it up to the IP. The bombardier would take it over, controlling the airplane from the IP to the target, which is about 20 miles. And when you're going about 180 miles an hour, that means it was about 4 or 5 minutes. That was fine if you could see the target visually. G helped a lot. G was very, very accurate. Actually, I participated in many what we call G-box competitions to see how close we can get to, and oddly enough, the targets we used were 2 churches in Britain, the church in Ely and another church. We knew the geographical coordinates, and we used to see how close we could come with the G. And the error sometimes was in feet, not yards, but feet. The difficulties of G was it was limited to 300 miles. In the PFF planes, as I say, we worked closely together. Usually, again, the G navigator brought it up to the IP, although all along the way there was chatter between the G navigator and the H2S navigator. The G would have the position, and we would check with the H2X, or the H2X would see something on the screen that he wasn't sure of, and he would check with G because the G navigator kept a log every 15 minutes of exactly where we were. For a good number of times, the flares were dropped and bombs were toggled. But actually, in many missions, each bomb group had 4 squadrons. And many times the bombing pattern was divided up. 2 squadrons went to one area, 2 went to another area. And quite often, and if there was overcast, quite often the bombing would be done with G, and because only one airplane had the H2X. The advantage of the H2X, not only was it more powerful, but it was a transceiver. The equipment itself transmitted the signal. It didn't require terrestrial stations. So that as long as it was operational, it could be operated any place in the world. It didn't require any external input. Toward the end of 1944, at least as soon as the Battle of the Bulge was over, it was pretty clear that the end of the war was coming soon. And at that time, the Battle of the Bulge was overcast most of the time, but on Christmas Eve, 1944, the clouds cleared over Bastogne and the Bulge. And for the first time in about a week or so, the bombers were able to take off. It was a radar mission, and it was a visual mission in the long run. But coming back, one of the worst storms to hit the United Kingdom in the century hit, and most of our airplanes couldn't get back, but no one got back to Bassingbourn. And at that point, radar and G, all of the planes had to disperse up to Scotland or Ireland. We lost no planes. A lot of crews had to sleep under a cold wing overnight till they got back to Bassingbourn. In preparation for D-Day, because we didn't know when D-Day was actually coming, although we knew it was coming soon, The first, as Norman pointed out, the original 10 B-17s had the H-2X radar installed in the 41st Bomb Group, a place that was specialized for radar. And the first radar equipped plane, the first one, came to the 91st Bomb Group. So we had this new plane with a nice white belly and a nice piece of equipment and a reorganized radio shack, but we had no navigators. Nobody knew about H-2X. And the 41st Bomb Group would send their navigators out to fly it. Sometimes they send some of the crew down too. That's where there's some hostility came between squadron leaders and who flew in the lead plane and who didn't fly in the lead plane. But one person who had to fly in the lead plane was the H-2X navigator. And according to the information that Norman had shared, but that's what he did share with me in the email yesterday, was that Stanley was assigned 3 missions to the 91st Bomb Group. One in March of 44, one in April, and one in May. The last one was May 2nd. In that period of time, while he was assigned to fly the airplane that was in the 91st Bomb Group, he was also instructing 91st Bomb Group navigators how to use the equipment. It was shortly after he left, I think he finished his training group with us on May 2nd, and I wasn't there at the time, but we had our own campus navigators flying, and they, in order to get used to the equipment, if they weren't, before they flew it or even if it was flown on a mission by the navigator from the 41st Group, they would practice. And what they practiced is on the English East Anglia coast on the North Sea, there's a lighthouse. And that lighthouse was is what the navigators, both the G navigator and the H-2X navigator, working together under blind conditions, try to assess the accuracy of it in preparation for D-Day. And it was amazing how accurate both were. On the morning of D-Day, about 3 in the morning, the group was alerted that D-Day had come and they were to fly. They were to fly before the Armada, Naval Armada arrived, before the troops were landed. And our group was assigned to bomb the Juno bridgehead, which was assigned to the Canadians and the French. And our group was led by John Howard. John Howard was taught how to use the HCX by Stanley Fine. And that's the link between Norman's uncle and me through John Howard. John Howard led the 91st Bomb Group, and I read his minutes for the meeting. He used G. It was a little interesting that when he took off from Bassingbourn, I should really point out, during several days before D, the equipment was used as a decoy. The 91st Bomb Group, and I think other bomb groups from the 8th Air Force, bombed the French coast opposite Dover to try to give a signal to Hitler that maybe we were going to invade by Dover. And there are some German records which indicate that, of course, Hitler believed it. But when the real mission came, there still was a little bit of a decoy, taking off of Bassingbourn a little bit toward Dover, then swinging over the channel, and he used G all the way to the IP. From the IP to the beaches at Juno, at the Juno landing, he used the H-2X. And it was partially overcast. It was a good use to have the H-2X there. And the results were amazing. It was for the Air Force, which flew a little different mission that time, the aircraft were aligned horizontally to cover the range of the gun rangery at the beach. And the target was right on. The combination of G and H-2X was 100% it was completed. And he made an interesting note, John did, that as he was on his way over the channel to the IP, and he swung south to come into France, he noticed his 5-inch screen was full of blips. He saw below him the armada of hundreds of ships heading for the shore. And from D-Day on, complete faith had been placed in the H-2X. Crews were getting accustomed to flying it, and the rest is history. Any questions?
We can take questions either in the chat, or if you want to indicate in your camera that you got a question, I'll try to unmute you and call on you. So
I don't see any questions down here.
let's see. Mick, the canoe,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Hi, George. Mick here. I'm the president of the 91st Bomb Group. Thank you for sharing all this
Hey,
with
Mike,
us.
how are you?
Doing well. Thanks for the invite. Just wanted to let you know, appreciate you sharing all of this with us. You said John Howard. Did you mean John Howland? I think it was John Howland that was the navigator on that D.
John Howard, Jack.
Yeah, Howland. Right. Very good. Just wanted to thank you for your doing, also getting some other people a chance to come up with a good question for them.
Well, I want to thank you for how well you're taking care of the 91st Bomb Group Memorial Association.
Thank you, George. I'll mute again.
Speak up,
Michael.
Go ahead, Phil Sternberg.
Yeah, George, how many missions did you fly?
I flew 6 combat missions and 3 humanitarian missions. And people say to me, the 8th Air Force flew humanitarian missions. Yes, they did toward the end of the war. They flew a very famous mission, dropping food to the starving Dutch people in early May of 1945. Then the most important mission I flew, and one of the most important days of my life, was our flying home 9,000 Allied prisoners of war from Stalingrad 1 deep in Germany, so they can get home a lot faster. And also the 8th Air Force, along with the 9th Air Force, participated in many humanitarian missions to bring aid and medical assistance to Holocaust camps.
I have a question over here under Marjorie Thompson.
Go ahead, Marjorie.
Gordon Thompson wants to ask a question. He's ex-RAF.
The RAF was using mosquitoes at one stage for pathfinding. Were they equipped with this stuff? Earlier on, possibly in the war, 43.
I think I can answer that because we had an RAF group on 91st Air Force. We had mosquitoes. That was the mosquito was awfully crowded for the Navigator.
Yes.
It was a beautiful airplane. It was made of wood.
Yes.
But it was an awful squeeze. I didn't fit. Being 6'3" at the time, I would have been very comfortable in it. They used G.
Yes.
And they did have their own radar system in, and they did exactly the same thing. And sometimes they took off, and I may not be correct about this, but I think sometimes they actually took off for 8th Air Force missions. Yeah, and they dropped the same smoke bombs and did pretty much the same thing. But they did it before. They did it before we went into PFF when we got the B-17s equipped with H-2X. They were doing PFF before that with the equipment they had, and at one time when they were doing it just with the G.
Right, thank you.
Until the German Me-262 jet came at the very end of the war, that Mosquito was one of the fastest airplanes in the sky.
See, I got a question here from Dave Myers. Did you have a call sign, George?
Pardon?
Did you have a call sign? That's Dave Myers' question.
Call sign?
Yeah.
My radio amateur call sign or the bomber call sign? My personal call sign is W3ASK. Our code sign on the top of the 91st Bomb Group for the 324th Squadron was DF, Delta F, and the third letter was representing the squadron.
Great. Roberta Danita, you want to go ahead?
I didn't hear that one.
Okay, go ahead and start.
My question is about the Pacific Theater. Was this technology used in the Pacific Theater after D-Day?
Yes, I could answer that question for you because that's where I would have been had the war not ended in August 1945. Our bomb group left based in England, Bassingbourn, in June 1945. We had a bit of a leave and we regrouped in Tampa, Florida, and we were waiting for the B-29s to come in. So we had to be B-29s. Fortunately, the war ended. The work that was done with the H-2X on the B-17s was really the predecessor for what eventually was standardized on the B-29. The B-29 not only had a upgraded H-2X, more simplified and easier to operate and more computer controlled, the entire aircraft was controlled by radar, including the bombing, the gun turrets and the bombing. The B-29 was really. That's my girlfriend calling me. Let me take a moment, please.
Go ahead and mute George for a second. Norma, did you have a comment on the Pacific, on the use in the Pacific?
I don't think it didn't serve as important a purpose in the Pacific. Yeah, they were going to move those guys over there, but there was a new an upgrade to the H-2X called the Eagle that George was talking about, and that probably is what was installed in the B-29s, but it wasn't important because just because the war was really won at that point, and they were just getting ready. They were going to have to invade, and they dropped those two bombs.
The second bomb was dropped on not its original target city, but another city because of weather.
So what I understand is that they were required, the B-29s that dropped the atomic bombs were required to have visual contact with the actual site where the bomb was to be dropped. And they, you know, Hiroshima had that bridge that looked like a T. That was their target. And Nagasaki, I don't.
Yeah, I don't. If it had been overcast, I mean, they would not have dropped atomic bombs.
No, it had to be visual bombing.
Yeah,
I see.
For the accuracy.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, Mike or Norman, there's a chat question from Lawrence Zimmerman here. He wanted to know, does increased frequency translate directly to increased definition of ground targets?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Proportional.
Yes.
Now, the lower the frequency, the higher the frequency, the more details you will see, because the shorter the band, the wavelength is. And I mean, wavelength frequency is a physical distance. So.
There was another question from Bruce Huffman who wanted to know, was the resolution sufficient to pick out the actual target from the ground clutter?
Yes. There are various things that help. Certainly, they must have used George, and you can check me on this. I would expect they would have used their charts, comparing their charts to the image they see on the scope. They were any water that was near, lakes, rivers, ocean that was near the target, they could see very clearly on the scope, and that would really help them. And in the later years of using that, the later months of using that H-2X, they started taking scope pictures, photographs of the scope, and they could then, before the mission, brief the radar guy on just where the target was, what his scope picture would look like when he was right at the target.
I can comment a bit more. And first, I want to say hello to my friend Nathan, who I think asked the question, and he has a son, Jacob, who is very dear to my heart, actually. That's controversial, even today, I think it's controversial. For coastlines, for metallic targets like bridges or marshalling yards, the H2X was beautiful. For specific point targets, that's where G came in. G could identify a target if it was in range of the ground transmitters in feet. And so quite often, by the way, after D-Day, as the Allied armies were advancing into Europe, the G system was extended in Europe. And when I was there in 1945, the G system covered the entire Europe. And at that time, that's why the two navigators worked so closely together, because we would get to a point that we calibrated the accuracy of the H2X along the way, as a matter of fact, because when you got to, and the motto of the 8th Air Force was pinpoint bombing rather than carpet bombing. The H2X navigator always had with him a picture that was given to him before he took off of what the target might look like on the scope. So he had a pretty good idea when he saw his target and he matched it against the picture. There have been mistakes made with that, but that's another story. So it was working hand in hand that was able to get it down to a point. The resolution, though, was very, very fine on coastlines, on a metallic objects. It was used quite often when the bridge was a target, as it was many times toward the end of the war, and it was overcast. The H2X was wonderful with it.
There's also another question in the chat, George, from Ann Kittredge Naylor on what the experience was like. What was it like in the air? You must have been freezing, buffeted by noise, terrified. Can you please say something about this?
It was like being in an aluminum soda can at 25,000 feet at 40 below zero. But I laugh when we look back. I'm sure we were very uncomfortable, but as I look back, I don't feel any of that. It was just the adrenaline of doing it, but it was tight. It was uncomfortable. We had no heat in the airplane, and we weren't pressurized, and so we really had a tough. We had to walk around after 10,000 feet with our gas masks. I'm not going into some of the stories of what if you had to go to the bathroom or something like that. It was uncomfortable, but I retrospectively am not complaining about it.
Let's see another one in the chat from Nathan Lee. Was this technology used in the B-24 or other bombers besides the B-17 or B-29? You want to go ahead on that one, Norman?
Yeah, it was. There were some in the B-24s, some installations, and they participated. My study and my book pretty much ends at D-Day. And before D-Day, it was a lot harder because, as George said, there were no G installations on the mainland, just in England. But after the war, as the Allies liberated parts of Europe, they built those G stations. And so, I mean, after the D-Day, then they could start doing that. So that certainly helped. But I don't think before D-Day, certainly for a deep penetration mission into Germany, where the planes were being built, I'm not sure how much they could rely on G. George?
Beyond 300 miles, it was visual, dead reckoning, looking out the window or looking out the bubble. If it was overcast, many missions were recalled because of it. G worked fine within its, there was another limiting factor, and it's remarkable how the two came together. Before January 1st, 1944, let's say, the fighters could not accompany the bombers beyond about 300 miles. The limit of fighter range was 300. So if the bombing target was Leipzig or someplace further than 300 miles from the area, after the fighters left the bombers were without fighter protection, and this accounted for some heavy losses. The P-51 came into service in late 1943, just about the same time as H-2X radar came in. And that gave us the full power we needed to go wherever we wanted to do in Europe within the range, the 1,000-mile range of the B-17. And that's when, beginning with 1944, we were able to reach targets as far as Stettin and Danzig and 8-hour missions. We were in here sometimes 8 hours, 4 going and 4 back, more or less. But we had the equipment to do it. And we had the H-2X to solve the weather problem, and we had the P-51s for the protection all the way up. In fact, I'm probably sitting here today because of the P-51, saving our B-17 when we were attacked by ME-262s.
Mick, you wanted to comment on a few of these things?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to. I mostly like hearing George because the whole point is to listen to the veterans before their stories are gone. So, but just real quickly, I posted on there, I just found chat. I'm new to this, is my first Zoom. So the answer to the call sign question was that there were 4 of them: Linger, Oboe, ironically, Dimple, and Mutter. That was for each of the 4 squadrons. That were their call signs. Individual planes. Yeah.
Thanks, Mick.
Yeah, of course. The Mosquito actually had 2 types of Raider. It started with night fighters, and they kept trying to get the size of the machine down and the resolution up to the point that they could finally start being an effective night fighter on the Mosquitoes. And I do believe the Lancasters did carry H-2S equipment as well. The last thing I'm going to say to George, and I'm going to choke on this, thank you so much for mentioning the Chowhound missions at the end of the war. The British called them the manna missions, but you dropped food to the Dutch. Yeah, well, the reason I do this is my parents were taken by the Germans in 1943 and forced to work in a labor camp. And my mom was with the Dutch resistance. So if it hadn't been for George, the P-51s that saved George, if it hadn't been for George, it wouldn't have saved my parents and I wouldn't have been here. So I just have to acknowledge our World War II veterans for having fought for the freedom of people they didn't even know. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you for saying that, Mick.
Thank you, Mike. Mitch.
We got a technical question from David Pius in the chat. How many watts did the radar put out after the installation of the new Magnetron?
Yeah, yeah, I saw that. Before the Magnetron, 20 watts was the maximum power that was ever transmitted at those frequencies. After that, the cavity magnetron in its first test transmitted, well, it wasn't transmitting, they just were measuring the power that it was putting out, 30,000 watts.
Okay, any more questions? Let me see here.
Just a P.S. Crews who flew on the PFF planes or the B-17s equipped with the H-2X were relatively happy to have it aboard because that little room that they added in that area with all that power, that was the warmest spot in the airplane.
That's the new one.
All right, I do want to let everybody know, I posted in the chat at least 3 ways to get the blind bombing book. It's available on Amazon and other booksellers. There's a link in the chat, and I can send this out in an email as well. Longleaf Services is the distributor, and you can contact them with the code 6SAFE-F19 for a 40% discount. And Norm said he's willing to inscribe them personally if you give him send him an email, nmfine@millwoodhouse.com. And I can send out an email to everyone who registered for today's event with that info as well. So do we have any last questions before we call it a day?
Mike, I don't see it in the chat.
Yeah, it should be at the very top, the first thing.
Nope, don't see it, sorry. But I've actually seen Mr. Fine before. I saw him last November at the Barnes at Rose Hill. So this is the second time I'm listening to Mr. Fine's talk.
Howdy.
Howdy.
You're going to be able to give my talk soon.
Say again?
You'll be able to give my talk soon for me.
About the Pathfinders? No. I'm just trying to find out more about the 15th Air Force at the moment, and about different transport groups in the 8th Air Force. So, just personal research. Hi, Sheldon. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Mark, good to see you.
I used to volunteer as a docent as well at the museum, way back when.
Kim, you want to go ahead with the question?
Yeah, she was asking about transport units. 440th Transport Group, or Wing, I believe it was, which actually wound up in Milwaukee after the war as a fighter squadron, then converted back to transport. Our oldest active member in the Department of Wisconsin is a man by the name of Harold Glick. Harold was a crew chief on C-47s in Europe in World War II. His aircraft participated in every airborne jump, and his plane was also rigged to tow gliders. Not all C-47s were. His was, and they did tow gliders on D-Day and for Market Garden. He also dropped supplies over Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. And as the war ended, his aircraft transported people from the camps to Belgium and Holland to relocation centers, and eventually transported some to England. And you can look up the 440th, you can see their whole history.
All right, so if there's no more questions, I just want to thank everyone for being on. Thank you, Norman, for all your research in the book. Thank you, George, for your service, for everything you did today.
Thank you for your service, George.
Sharing your stories, which are remarkable.
I have a question. Stan Stoller.
Go ahead, Stan.
My picture's not up there for some reason. As you know, toward the end of World War II, there were discussions in Washington of bombing the concentration camp railways. Did that information stay in Washington, or did it ever get down to the bomber groups? Did you ever hear about it when you were in the bomber groups in the UK?
We learned about the Holocaust the same way as most of us in the world did. That was very towards the end of the war as the camps were being liberated. And after the camps were liberated, the Air Force had many humanitarian missions. During the war, I don't think there were people. There were evidence being presented that these camps may be existing, but I higher up, if I remember correctly, it felt that the distance to the camps were beyond the range of normal use.
That's an important.
The reason I hesitate in answering to you, one of the biggest roles that oh gosh, hold on a minute.
Popular guy.
Mute George. Okay.
Reason I hesitate, the P-51s, one of their main targets during the war was shooting up the entire railway system of Germany. Now, that was not necessarily the fact that Holocaust victims were being transported on the railway was not necessarily in the equation of why the P-51s were doing it, because I don't think that was well enough known then. But the P-51s did destroy a lot of German railway systems, and there was something on YouTube recently I saw where actually the P-51s got to the locomotive, the rest of the train just collapsed, and there were people being escorted, being sent to concentration camp who were liberated them. That was toward the end of the war, and all these people who survived the bombing of the train were in the fields at about 2 or 3 days later when the Allied armies arrived. So there is a possibility that in many cases the bombing of the rail lines by the P-51s may have saved some people from the camps.
Yeah. There's another more political answer to that, and that is that the military in particular saw that as a bad use of resources. In other words, they wanted the bombers to make sure they were bombing the factories and the troops and things of that nature, and that to go out to that distance to try to bomb railroad lines, that, as they found out too, were sometimes repaired within 2 or 3 hours after they had been bombed, was a total misuse of resources. So that never really got traction.
Edwin Cohen, I see you got your hand raised. Did you have a question?
No.
Okay. All right, well, thank you, everyone. We will be doing a couple of these next month. We've got ones planned on a Civil War one with the Chappelle Manuscript Foundation. So that should be coming up in June, as well as Boaz Thayer, who has a new book on World War II veterans who served with the formation of the Israeli Air Force in 1948. So look for those coming up. And so thanks to everyone, and we will see you next time. Oh, wait, did Michelle and Abraham, did you have a question?
Yes, Michael Art Richardson here for
Hey.
Norm Fine. Norman, I understand that there was an award that was presented most recently to you for your book, Blind Bombing. You might have covered that already, but we came in just a touch late here, being new to Zoom. But could you tell us about that? Because that's really important.
Yes, Mike did mention that, or Sheldon in his introduction. Yeah, I learned yesterday that the book was awarded a silver medal by an IPPY award, they call it. It's a national magazine that is for the independent publishers in the country. So thanks for mentioning it.
All right, we'll end on that note. Congratulations, Norm, on the award, and hopefully everyone can go ahead and get the book. Thanks for being here today.
Hey, Mike.
Thank you all.